Nice. Right, to call this out for order, the motion that we would not release details or personal details of criminal suspects, I invite the Prime Minister Nishant Sarvalingam to start this debate.
First of all, hi Saron. When the Daily Telegraph in 2013 reports black guy rapes woman, that enforces stereotypes in American societies that all black guys are out to rape poor white women. If I go to a newscast headstand right now, what did I say? If I go to a newspaper stand right now, I would be able to read headlines such as 2 Indian guys rob 7-Eleven, Iranian drug dealer involved in prostitution ring. This debate is about the media as an engine for social identity and the progressions of ideas. And Team Proposition is not willing to stand by and allow this form of negative affirmation to occur in our society. What we're not okay with, we do not give out race, religion, class, or even the name of the criminal or criminal suspects, and this includes pictures. We think reporting can still occur in any way. It just comes down to the phrasing of those newspapers and what information they choose to put forward. On the idea, we're going to tell you about how publishing this information is not only unnecessary, and it should never factor into the rational calculus of the readers, but it's also extremely harmful that it does. Now, before we get into that, quick word on free speech. We think free speech still has a lot of room to breathe. Later, we love free speech and we want it to flourish. So we encourage investigative journalism and all of these forms of things, but we know that free speech always comes with utility. When free speech can harm a major society, when there's a lack of utility, we don't release information anyway. For example, we don't release military secrets. When there's big drug cases, sometimes we don't talk about suspects and rats and moles because that could be strategically difficult for investigations. So right now, in investigative journalism, we're cool with a lot of things being withheld. This will merely be an extension of those principles. So free speech aside, let's get to the fun part. I'm going to talk to you about newspapers and what's the real harm. But before that, quickly get it out.
Will you release this information to, say, judges or law enforcement officers?
That's why at the start of this debate, I said it was about media and society. These are the two parties that are involved. The police and the jury and the judges have their own thing going on. We're focusing on not releasing it to media and people. All right, cool. So let's talk about the people then. There are 3 readers that buy newspapers and watch news. 3 forms of attitude in approaching this. The first extreme are the bigots. These are the people that will read the headline, 2 Indian guys robbed 7-Eleven, and they will say, I knew these Indian guys, cannot trust one. They'll turn to their daughter and say, hey, don't talk to them in school. The other extreme is the persecuted, the people that are Indian and are reading the headlines. 2 Indian people robbed 7-Eleven. Indian people don't do that. This is outrageous. How could you? We're good people, you know. But the vast majority of readers is the average reasonable person. Now, this is not a person that's bigoted or persecuted. This is just the average guy. And how the average guy feels is he feels repulsed. There's a sort of morbid fascination that happens in them when they see this form of controversial, sensationalist data. It's the fact that this guy might be a terrorist because he's Muslim. This guy might be a thief or a robber because he's Indian. That thing causes this form of repulsion that while they might not agree with it, their anger is not towards the star or the newspaper or the broadcaster. Their anger is towards the news, and that repulsion will cause them to spread it to their friends. They will go to their friends and be, hey, check this out. Look at this headline that says this thing. So basically, publicity sells. It's not bad publicity, it's not good publicity, but people are into this kind of sensationalist news and people buy it. That's why newspaper companies will always have an incentive to make these their headlines. Because Indian guy robbed 7-Eleven is a much better headline than 2 guys robbed 7-Eleven. It's likely to catch your eye more. We want to change that from that headline to this headline, where you don't put in class, poor people, race. We just want a normal headline in detailing persons. So when you have a biased kind of headline, this is what happens. First level, there is no need for this information in that report. That shred of knowledge that he's Indian, that he's Malay, that he's Muslim, doesn't affect the overall news. It doesn't deliver a different form of news. It doesn't deliver a different form of impact that could be seen as anyway positive. It doesn't need to factor into your rational calculus as a reader that this person was anything more than a person like you and me who did a bad thing. All you need to know is this is what's happening in our society. So first of all, there is no need for this to factor in, but when it does factor in, here's what happens. It is nothing more than blatant racism and classism. The fact that Muslim people in America are so persecuted after 9/11 was, come on, my name is Khan and I'm not a terrorist. But that movie didn't even make a ripple, because if you go to 7-Eleven and there's a guy in a turban, you don't want to shop at 7-Eleven. You will whisper to your partner, hey, I think that guy's a terrorist. And this kind of persecution happens in the United States because they've somehow drawn a link that all Muslims belong to Al-Qaeda. Over here, poor people are constantly being segregated because we assume they're driven by depravity to rape, kill, and steal, the immoral, lazy poor. And it's these kinds of things that causes, one, to disenfranchise people from our society, Indians, Muslims, denominations and minorities of society, which Aaron will go on to explain to you why that will become a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way. But secondly, it causes us to be less likely to reach out and help minorities, and this is especially true in the case of the poor. If headlines continue to headline you as a dangerous, lazy, poor person, what will happen is that, it creates predispositions against poor people. You're less likely to give aid or help poor people if you're opposed to them. It is shameful that that happens, and it does. So, lastly, even if they want to argue on the final premise that it is necessary for me as an individual, if the headline says 2 Indians have raped a girl, I should be more wary of Indians. Meaning when I go out into the street and I see 2 Indians, I should be more cautious. They might assume that this is a benefit in my safety. It's not. It's counterproductive. Here's why. I should be on the lookout for all rapists. The Indian, Chinese, or Malay rapists shouldn't even be in my rational calculus when I'm walking down the street at night, which you should never do, ladies and gentlemen. Take care. But you're walking down the street. If you are only wary of Indian rapists, which you have somehow in your mind created a link to be more likely rapists, if you have done that, then you're not watching for the Chinese guy that's approaching behind you. You're not watching for the Malay guy around the corner. That is the way that if it does influence your rational calculus, it does it in a negative way. So there can be no benefit, no add-on to the news, but instead only ideas of blatant racism, classism, and unnecessary links formed between people and the media that cause disenfranchisement and much greater things. We don't need this. Let's stop newspapers from using this as sensational tools to boost profits and destroy our society. I'm Indian, I'm not a rapist, I'm not a terrorist, I'm just a debater trying to win. Thank you.
Thank you, Prime Minister. In response to the government sector, I invite Aditya Mitra. Can you see yourself on the screen?
I can't actually, but the audio is working, so it's fine. Like the screen is black, but like the audio is, yeah. It just says you, and it's like a black screen. African American screen, sorry. Okay, there's one more. Right here. Let it be, let it be. Oh, the chicken. Oh, yeah, chicken. Shit. Still remember MDU. It's horrible. I use it as a timer. Oh, right, better. Yep. Chair. Okay. You look nice? Okay. Makeup?
Mitra E.
Oh, okay.
Chal.
Yep. Yep. Mr. Speaker, in the state of New York, stop and ID laws were recently removed by the Constitutional Court, the federal court, after a black civil society group petitioned them saying that the police disproportionately targeted Latinos and blacks to frisk them and stop them for checks. That's the kind of thing that would never happen under side propositions policy. The fact that there are institutional problems which face things like African Americans or poor individuals, it's important to know these factors about criminals to target discourse and resources towards those things. I'm going to offer 2 points of contention. Firstly, this is also my constructive matter. Firstly, our policy offers protection to suspects, how you can identify certain suspects who are vulnerable and extend help to them. Secondly, how crimes and social indicators are linked, and sometimes there is a link between your social background and the crimes that you commit, and how best discourse is targeted to these communities under our policy. My rebuttals will be integrated, but 2 points will stand out. Firstly, there was this whole rant from Nishan about the average reasonable person, and he said that the reason we want this policy in place is because these people feel repulsed by this news. Firstly, that's an assertion in and of itself. You can never prove that these individuals feel repulsed, but even if they do, why should repulsion of a few individuals be the metric for passing this policy? Something he did not explain. But secondly, if it is actually true that repulsion is like the larger group of people are repulsed at this news, it's a self-regulating mechanism, because news channels want ratings, right? If people are repulsed and don't watch the news, they're likely to change those news headlines because they want more ratings. It's a self-regulating mechanism. But secondly, there's a multitude of news available, right? We're lucky for us, we don't all live in Texas watching like Fox News, right? The fact that you have Slate, Huffington Post, CNN, a whole spectrum of conservative to liberal to responsible media outlets who often gain awards in editorial and journalism factors because they're responsible media outlets, right? So it's false to say that all news is inflammatory and all news is absurd. But thirdly, right, it's not that all individuals just read the headline. I don't even believe that all headlines look like that, but even if it is true, those headlines are usually followed by news stories which describe other aspects of that crime and often associate that crime to other factors, right? So you just assume that people don't read anything at all and just skim through the news. My arguments. Firstly, offer protection to suspects. We will contend from side opposition that people with certain characteristics often need special help during the trial process due to institutional biases within our system. The fact that I said stop and ID laws disproportionately targeted Latinos and blacks and frisked them, 90% of the people who were frisked in the streets were Latinos and blacks, show that the police has institutionalized racism. The only way the civil society for African American groups could ever fight that in federal court is because they had that data and evidence to show in that court to bring that law down. The fact that they said that the judges will be able to access this information. Judges in the US are majority upper white class men. The fact that there might be institutionalized racism or they might be sentencing some African American individuals unfairly is something that we can never analyze if we don't have this evidence in the media to discuss these things. The fact that police disproportionately target blacks and mistreatment in jail is disproportionately affecting these communities. It means it's important to identify as an important check and balance against this institutionalized racism within these institutions. We think that's a problem. The only way you could ever challenge such institutionalized racism is knowing who these individuals are and what communities they come from and whether they're not being targeted or not. Secondly, within this argument, the fact that people from certain communities often need special help. What does this mean? The fact that often quid pro quo lawyers often work for extremely poor people to try and fight their courts through the appellate system. The fact that courts, like state lawyers, are often extremely lousy, and quid pro quo lawyers often fight cases for extremely poor people. It's impossible for these quid pro quo lawyers or any activists to ever fight for individuals who are disadvantaged due to their economical situation because they can never identify those individuals in the first place. Our policy allows individuals like activists and quid pro quo lawyers to identify individuals who need the most help and target help towards them. Yes?
You just consider that there are systemic problems with racism in the way jail and law operate. So his solution is to keep furthering mainstream media with racist titles and racist articles to persist.
Okay, firstly, I never said or conceded that all media does it in the first place. But secondly, your ability to target racism in the system is only possible when you have evidence of that bias happening in the first place. If you can't even prove in a court of law or to a senatorial committee that this discrimination happens in the first place, how can you possibly ever find resolutions to that problem? Second argument, crimes and social indicators. We will contend from side opposition that we agree that not all crimes are driven by societal factors. But we think there's a high statistical correlation between certain crimes and your background. the fact that majority of people targeted for drug laws and currently incarcerated in the US for drug crimes or petty drug crimes are African Americans. The fact there's a high correlation between a lack of education and your impetus or incentive to commit crimes. The fact that people from disadvantaged communities or economically disadvantaged are more likely to fall into crimes or join gangs to sustain their lives. Those are things which are realistic problems which you shove under the carpet because you say that there are no societal factors which may affect crime. That's a problem. Our policy does two things. Firstly, this information allows us to highlight these factors and direct discourse towards these issues. The fact that mayors are more likely to direct more police resources towards communities where crime is more prevalent. The fact that there's more resources and discourse about these problems in the first place to try and tackle those problems. But the second thing our policy does is extremely important, and this clashes with this disposition point, right? We will contend from side opposition that usually under status quo, electorates have no incentive to push education in poor backgrounds, right? A normal average voter has no incentive to push educational resources towards poor individuals because it's not in his self-interest. What does our policy do? Our policy directly links the lack of resources in education to things like crimes in drug crimes. The fact that now you align incentives. You tell the normal average voter that if you don't, that there's a high statistical correlation between educational background and the crimes that people commit. So it's more likely that these people want to protect themselves against crime, and therefore it becomes more likely they're going to push their electorates, like their senators, like their House of Representatives, like their mayors in local cities and towns, to push more resources towards it. Our policy incentivizes that. It incentivizes politicians and electorates to resolve these issues, right? Because low crime is something that is in favor of all individuals, and that's how we align incentives under status quo. The problem with their policy is that it just assumes a unifaceted media in the first place. We contend from side opposition that that's not obviously the case. And if that is the case, Mr. Speaker, then you should target the media institutions. You shouldn't block out other pertinent institutions like civil society institutions, like law firms who want to help these people, like activist groups fighting for racial equality in the law and under the law, Mr. Speaker. Those are the kind of important groups that you block out. Now, when you say that race is never a factor, or we will never reveal this in the first place, it's false for them to say that race can never be a factor. We agree that race is not always a factor, but for certain crimes it is, right? The fact that there's a massive debate in the US about legalization of marijuana. And Obama said this in his speech. These laws disproportionately target African Americans, right? The reason why these laws are being repealed in the first place is because they're racist. The fact that there is review on things like sentencing and incarceration for marijuana laws is because they target African Americans disproportionately. That kind of discourse can never happen under their policy. If you want a responsible media, that's self-regulating and exists already. But for all the other problems, I'm extremely proud to oppose.
Thank you, leader. Now moving forward to Deputy Prime Minister Aaron.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm a kid who's 18. I grew up in a society where it's my automatic response to relate an Indian on a motorcycle coming towards me as a rapist or a snatch theft. That is the power of label society, of the labels that media puts on society. It segregates certain communities. It tells them that these people are more likely to commit crimes. And that very label, that very segregation, sometimes it does make them commit more crimes. I'm going to talk to you about the self-fulfilling prophecy. How when you marginalize communities, when you segregate them, you put them in a position where they're less likely to be able to break those stereotypes and get out of this vicious cycle. But first, let's answer a few questions. Number one, what exactly is our stance? We want to focus on the relationship between media, the labels they put on suspects, and the societal impact that follows. This was not a part of the debate they really engaged on. They tried to decide to throw away the entire idea of societal impact and how it shapes our perceptions of society. We think that's a rich debate happening right there, and they should engage with it. Even so, we are not okay with racial profiling in any sense. We don't think that police officers have any right to specifically target certain races just because there's a statistical correlation that you so proudly trump. Okay. Second question. Okay. How about the idea that news agencies are self-regulatory? No, thank you. Please take a seat. Now, here's the thing. You do not go on Facebook very much, Aditya. When a news article is more controversial, more repulsive, you are going to share the shit out of that article. You're going to let everyone know that, man, I disagree with this article. Please read it and give them more news coverage. That's what your intent is. Even if the article is so terrible, you're going to share it anyway. Repulsion does not kill a news agency, it makes them grow stronger. So the self-regulatory mechanism you're talking about here is not really working, Aditya. Tell me, why does the Daily Mail still exist? Why does Utusan Melayu or Malaysia or whatever still exist? It exists because people either like that news or they're so awfully repulsed by it that they share it even more. So what about other aspects? He says that people will still read through the entire article. They won't skim. Even if you read through the entire article, the association that that Indian man is a rapist still exists in your mind. You might read everything else in the article, but that headline or that certain phrasing in the subtext that says Indian bad rapist will stick in your mind as a subconscious reminder that society, we should totally discriminate Indian people riding on motorcycles because they're probably rapists, right? Yes.
Considering your prejudice and segregation is status quo according to your analysis, how does removing these personal details from today forward change that?
Well, the first change that happens is people no longer associate certain crimes with certain people or certain communities. We think that's a brilliant start. It also trickles down to our police officers when they don't always see in the media, news, places in other precincts, these races are always the ones doing crimes. That is how we change the perception to say that we shouldn't associate people with certain crimes. Okay. Third question, institutionalized racism. Now, I don't get the idea coming from Aditya. He's saying that when we report that this person was arrested by the police, people, the natural response is say, aha, the police, they're discriminating this guy, this specific race. But let's be realistic. When you see a news report that associates a person with a particular community, what's your reaction? Do you say, yes, institutionalized racism, let me petition against this, let me fight against it? Or is your response, yeah man, Indians, I always knew that they were the ones causing the crime? Your response when seeing that news report isn't to challenge notions that maybe there's institutionalized racism, is to further trump and to further solidify this idea that that particular community is a community of criminals. And one day as a child you grow up to be a policeman, you continue that racism and that institutionalized racism. So we don't think that institutionalized racism can be cracked down under your proposal. Revealing it in the news doesn't make people challenge things, it just solidifies the bad stereotypes. Fine. So we think that a better check and balance has to exist, maybe within the department. Society cannot act as a check and balance because they are never shown to challenge these kind of functions in society. No, thank you. Final question. How about the statistical correlation that people deserve to know which race is the worst race so they can protect their children and protect their loved ones from this race? Well, number one, my first response is racism, dude. That's racism. When you say that one person is more likely to commit a crime just because of his skin color, that is the definition of racism. So we think that in itself, it rebuts itself. But more importantly, how about Nishan's idea? When you say that a certain community is supposed to commit more crime, you ignore the fact that crime can exist regardless of community. More so, those news articles you see don't provide you statistics. They don't say that 60% of blacks commit the crime. They just give you a news story. And you automatically associate that news story of black people hurting people with the idea that all black people are supposed to hurt people, even if it's not statistically founded. News articles don't show you the statistics. They make a story, you make the affiliation yourself. No, thank you. So even there's no such thing as statistical correlation here. But more importantly, how about a self-fulfilling prophecy? The idea that the more we segregate people, the more they are put in a position to keep getting segregated. This is the context. The media is propagating the idea that some races or classes are affiliated with certain crimes. Now, they're not just propagating racism here, by the way. They're propagating a self-fulfilling prophecy. What does this argument try to show to you? This argument is the idea that the way your society treats your community also shapes the way your community behaves in relation to society. If you are marginalized, you are put in a position where you are more likely to do things that get you marginalized even more. That is the idea. And we think that this is where the debate truly lies. The ideas of societal perception talked about Nishan, totally ignored by their side. No, thank you, take a seat. Why does this happen? And this is an important question. Number one, there's a reinforcement of stereotypes when you read the news. When you see certain communities continuously being affiliated and linked with certain crimes. If you're from the African continent, you are likely to be a bad tenant. If you are an Indian, rapist. Man, I hate that idea because I'm Indian. But number two, this shapes society's perception. Maybe you think these people are more likely to be criminals. This nationality, this race, this class, this part of society, they're going to be criminals. And I'm going to treat them as such. At least be aware. What happens? Two things. Either you're already a racist person, this solidifies the idea that you're right all the while. I'm right to be racist. It's fine to treat black people this way because, hey, the Daily Mail is telling me to do it. The Star is telling me that this is a valid correlation. Even if you're a nice person, there's a subconscious idea that maybe I should be more careful. And this thirdly leads to real-world discrimination. Let's give you a few examples. If you're an African person, good luck getting good housing in Malaysia right now after the entire ruckus that happened in that one apartment, that one news story. And everyone thinks that Nigerians are bad tenants. If you're in India with facial hair, good luck picking up a girl at a nightclub. Just saying. Okay? These are the kinds of things, real world discrimination that happens because of the media, the stereotypes propagated by media. People don't get job opportunities. How about anti-discrimination laws? Well, good luck with that, because the very social interaction with those races and communities is denied. The ability, the people shun you socially, and that also creates the personality that we'll have in the future. So it's not just job opportunities, it's also the very social interaction you get from society that makes you even more of a person likely to commit crimes. It takes away your social support, it takes away your opportunities, you're more likely to be thrown in poverty, and all those kinds of things puts you in a position where you're more likely to commit that crime and perpetuate this entire cycle that, yeah, maybe my community deserves to be shunned and segregated. Shameful.
Yeah. Thank you, Arlu. Now I invite Julie. Yeah.
Oh, how fast a debate degenerates, right?
Let's just have a dance party. I don't think there's a debate happening there. What is it? I think it's a riot. It's a sex party. No, it's a riot. The race riot. Must be Indians. It's done.
Okay, they're good.
Beverage is right. Oh, damn.
Behind
you. Oh, if they're Indian, then they must also be drunk. Drunk on the... Go on.
The calculus of this debate is extremely simple. We all agree that such trials happen in a context of great ambiguity and controversy. But there's great media attention. People want to know what is going on. Since we all agree that you can't stop public attention and reporting on this, right? So you really want to check the sort of social opinions that are spread about it, so as to ensure outcomes of, say, a fair trial process with accountability and fair discourse, and greater discourse within the media and the social sphere. To sum it up very simply, right? If I'm a black man who finds that the way I'm treated by the judge, the jury, by law enforcement, by society, is not fair, the issue is not stopping all discourse, but talking about it. Prejudice already happens. How then do we break it? First and foremost, two rebuttals. Firstly, on the media, the thing that's so obsessed with, and secondly, on the idea of the impact of discourse. On solving prejudice. So firstly, on the media, right, you realize that both their speeches rest on a very flawed premise. The idea that all rapes will be by Indians, so all headlines are going to read Indian rapist goes after women. Right? So there's something really wrong here, because the point is when you have factual revelation of all the different social groups of people carry out such crimes, it will prove this stereotype wrong. It will prove the rapists out there are not only of a certain race. That is what truly challenges generalizations on the side of people. Furthermore, we've already shown you, right, that the idea of sensationalist news is quite a narrow scope, right? There are many fair and widely read news channels out there. There's also a way of tactfully reporting news, right? And even if there isn't, and even if only Indian rapists are reported in the news, right, the fact that we allow revelation of personal particulars means that there are many also other different personal factors, like your income group and so on, also made clear. So you're more than just an Indian rapist. It's a natural check on people's tendency to typecast one race for being rapist, or one rapist for being the result of his race. But look at also other social groups out there, and how one person may disadvantaged or unfairly judged as a result of his group. No, thank you. We also see in them, right, two concessions. Firstly, the idea that a judge should still know about your personal details. Therefore, we realize that trials should always take note of public norm and be attached to reality. That's what the people must also know. Furthermore, I think they have this concession, right, that people are hungry for information. And it's really strange that you want to report things but not include any information. I hope they let us know, right, how the headline "random man rapes random woman" really plays a part in news. But anyway, right, what they're going to do through the omission of information is to feed the speculation that comes with sensationalism, the sensationalist news that we really don't want, right? For instance, the slow release of details of the suspects for the Boston Marathon bombings led to people misrepresenting them as being Arab and therefore linking that in terms of stereotypes to terrorism, right? At least we create full discourse that allows for a fair assessment of your social groups or social norms and whether we are perceiving it unfairly. Moving on to my second rebuttal on solving prejudice. No, thank you, sir. So let me characterize how prejudice really plays out in the judicial system, right? We think that prejudice, when exploited by sensationalist news, right, that often comes from ignorance, existing ignorance in society and fear. And this ignorance, right, comes from a disregard of racial realities and social trends in society. Let me give you an example, the George Zimmerman trial. If we want to argue there's prejudice impeding judicial process, right, we realize that this is often facilitated by things like microaggressions, right, things like a problematic jury with only a white woman in the jury. And it's very hard for people to say there are microaggressions being held against me. It's very hard for me to say maybe the police has an attitude towards me, maybe small actions spurred greater black violence in a reaction towards policemen. But however, now that we are sort of reporting in a moment, sir, you create a baseline of proof where we say maybe the reason why black people are constantly being brought in by the police for more severe drug crimes means that maybe something is the issue with the way we treat different social groups. So we allow such microaggressions to be really tracked, and therefore we allow full discourse on it, and instead of people just saying, oh, I think blacks should be like this. Before I go on, I'll take a point.
I'm quite hurt because I spent 3 minutes of my speech telling you how news is never objective and they always feed into stereotypes. Your speech thus far is premised on news objectively reporting what happens and telling it as it is. No, it's not about court cases. It's about media.
No, it isn't. I agree that there are prejudices in society. I agree that discourse is often subjective. That is why I say there must be a basis of full information upon which discourse can be more progressive. Because just speculation or just one random idea that he is Indian is not enough for which you can fully discuss social norms and police aggression and so on. I'm very hurt that I spent 3 minutes of my speech on this and didn't listen to it at all. But moving back to my rebuttals, right? How do you fully resolve prejudice then? By replacing ignorance and generalization with open and frank discussion with how individual and social norms interact. Let's look at how proper discussion on social norms exists, right? It's when you realize that the personal and the political are intertwined. When it's an interaction between how individuals and social groups work in a sort of two-way interaction, right? For instance, details about your social groups reveal something about trends like racism. At the same time, trends let you know what individuals need in their personal life. For instance, my low-income group may affect my calculus with regards to theft. That is, so basically, if you want to resolve any sort of racism or so on, you must be aware of all the different social characteristics. No, thank you. That fits nicely into my 2 points today. Firstly, on humanizing the criminal suspect regardless of innocence or guilt. The problem nowadays, as pointed out by Aditya, right, is that basically you have judges that often come from rich, white, privileged backgrounds and don't really understand different social norms and how they affect people beyond the sort of stereotypes that both sides are so afraid of. So what happens under our paradigm when you release all this different information and allow for free discourse on how they affect people's behaviors? You reconnect judgments to reality, right? So things like sentencing, like statements, like the decision on mitigating circumstances is made a lot more detailed because it's linked to proper characteristics. We think that this is extremely important, right? Because judge statements often have a very big impact in directing social values because people see that judges have very high social positions. And furthermore, they are seen as the official line of the court. That's precisely why in the Nevada rape case, right, when this judge came out and said, I gave the rapist a lighter sentence because the fact that the girl had teenage pregnancies meant that she was more promiscuous and asked for it. That is why that ignited such controversy. Because we think that judges have so much influence with how they engage with social backgrounds and personal particulars. Furthermore, it reconnects the trials, the reality that they're meant to govern. On a discourse level, right, and the questions to be substantive, we also realize that you create greater room for intersectionality. You can see how the treatment of individuals is shaped by the combination of different social influences. Maybe you're Indian, maybe you're poor, maybe there are so many other things in play. So the advances social activist discourse on crime, right, on how basically crime could be affected, or the treatment of crime could be affected by so many other different social oppressions and factors. It is really important for social activist discourse to overlap into crime, because laws often decide what is right and wrong in society and how your voices may feature into it. We also see social activism moving towards intersectionality to deal with a diverse society and how we interact with it. For all these reasons, therefore, we believe that because so many different social factors come into play with how we look at crime, how we look at people, all this must be considered in any discourse about crime. For all those reasons, I'm very proud to oppose.
We have the final substance speaker, Number
I'm going to look at this debate from three perspectives. I think we can all agree that side opposition's entire case is predicated upon there being a need for this in the media in order to achieve a certain goal. Therefore, I will show you why there is no necessity for this specifically to achieve their goals, which means that their entire case will fall. Because if I can show you that there isn't a necessity for what they said and there are other better ways to achieve it that don't have the harms that will come with everything that Nishant and Aaron talked about that was so conveniently ignored by that side of the house, then their case falls. I'm going to ask three questions. Firstly, is there a link between crime and your social background? Secondly, is there a necessity for their side of the house? And thirdly, the benefits and harms of this policy. Firstly, is there a link? They told us that there's a statistical correlation between your social background and you committing a crime. They left out one very important part. The statistical correlation they talked about was the correlation between people committing a crime, and of that group of people who commit a crime, how many of them are composed of this demographic. They failed to take into account the fact that that statistical correlation doesn't render the fact that of all the Indians, only a small minority actually commit crimes. So what they do is they inflate that correlated statistic in order to give the perception that it's Indians who commit crimes. But in reality, if you look at the entire demographic, which is never ever published, then you find out that there isn't really a statistical correlation between that. So on mathematical grounds alone, their case falls. But then the second reason they told us for this was that the media was true. If it happens that all Indians are the ones who rape, then it must be true in some way. Look, this is how it works. If there is already an existing institution of racism, then it's more likely that news corporations will report those kinds of crimes more than other kinds of crimes. For example, in the state of Penang, where I come from, if a Chinese rapes a person, they are less likely to characterize the person as Chinese because that's just not popular sentiment. That's how it works. In places where there's already existing racism, that's why the news corporations pander to that kind of racism. That's why the opinion you get in the media in of itself is wrong. So given that they premised that point on the fact that the media is right and that those statistics are right, those statistics and media news in of themselves are influenced by the racism that we want to fight. So you can't use that as proof. Second question, is there a necessity? So I've already debunked that even if there was a link, it's definitely not anything they said, and certainly it cannot be used as any judgment or, since they want to put it, a metric for evaluating this. What were the things that they wanted to achieve that they told us were necessary for? Three things. Firstly, they told us, we want activists to be able to get information through knowing this. Second, we want quid pro quo lawyers to be able to offer pro bono services to people who are disenfranchised. Thirdly, we want people to be able to fight laws. And a lot of this was repeated in Hui Yi's speech, largely a rehash of Aditya's speech. She told us, and Aditya told us this. All those are reasons why we must exclusively have this policy. Let me now tell you how you can do it in other ways. The people who they talked about, people who actively help the poor and help the black population, are people who are going to go hunting for this information anyway. The activists you talk about are not people who sit on their butts waiting for a news report to come out before they go and challenge something. Those are the people who are in courts looking at what's going on and who will fight for the cause nonetheless. Those aren't the people that need this information in order to fight. Now, second fact that they ignored, most people are not activists. So if you operate on the principle that you want this news report to target a small group of people who will go looking for that information anyway, then all the harms that we talked about still exist, but you get a marginal benefit that can be achieved anyway because those are people who are going to protest anyway. Furthermore, we were never against any reporting of there being a large upscale movement against racism in courts. They assume that we're going to ban any reporting on people fighting against racism in courts. We were never going to do that. We told you we are not okay with racial profiling. Yes, okay, I'll take you. Go. One of you. No.
Are you telling me that in Western liberal democracies, there's only one channel which will report that only Latinos commit crimes, and no other channels exist as a counterbalance?
Okay. Even if other channels exist as a counterbalance, the fact that those channels exist means there is a significant population that you are pandering to that is dying into that kind of news. We don't want that societal perception to be furthered because the fact that those news corporations exist is proof in of itself that there is a population which is influenced by this because news corporations go after profit. Third thing he told us on necessity, that you allow for the helping of poor people, the electorate will never help them anyway. This is patently false. Voting is almost always split along binary lines between the right and the left. You have the pro-welfare, low taxation, pro-capital gains, and then you have the other side. That's why it's almost always split between pandering to rich voters and pandering to poor voters. This is evident in almost all Western liberal democracies. For them to say that there is no incentive order place for them to help poor people is ignoring the fact that the poor people make up a large voting group that you want to get to because those people will vote for you. It's the reason why in so many Western liberal democracies, your voting is split along people pandering to rich people who favor low taxation versus the other group who favor high taxation of the rich, pro-welfare, low capital gains, those kinds of things. That's the reason why, and it's simply blatantly false to say that there isn't an incentive to help the poor. That's not true. Finally, and this is the biggest flaw on their side of the house, they told us that they had a problem with the institutions that were there, the police force, the judging, the jury. Okay, look, them having a problem with the jury is an inherent flaw of the jury system. Just because America does it, it doesn't make it right. Secondly, if they have a problem with judging, then that debate doesn't tie into this at all. Because, like, guys, I know you think it's our burden to solve everything in the world. It's not. If someone sits in court, it's kind of hard to ignore the fact that he's an African American with the judge looking right at him. Those are things we can't regulate. We can't ask judges to walk into court blindfolded and listen to the facts of the case. These are things that we can solve. That's the burden we took upon ourselves. That's what we solve. So at the end of the day, it comes down to the benefits versus the harms. I've told you already, and we've been consistent throughout the debate in telling you this. What they want, the lawyers that fight for people, are not predicated upon knowing those things in the news. These are people who go out there and look for it anyway. These are people to whom, because they advertise in the news, without them needing to go to the poor people come to them, like the late Karpal Singh. Poor people came to him for help because he was accessible. He didn't need to go hunting for them because he was already a famous lawyer. That's the kind of thing that already exists. Those things are not things you need media reports for. But all the harms under our side, Aaron told you already. In fact, the fact that they think there's a statistical correlation could well be because of the self-fulfilling prophecy that Aaron talked about. You make policemen more likely to go after black people. In fact, less incarceration of white people could very well be caused by the fact that policemen don't go looking for white people. It's as simple as this. If you focus on stopping crime, you will stop crime. You don't need to focus on stopping black crime to stop more crime. It's as simple as that. So at the end of the day, given that there is no necessity for any of the benefits we talked about, it's not mutually exclusive, versus all the harms that we talked about, and finally, because they're just racist, they look at statistics and correlations that say that that's just the way things are, we're not going to change it. We think that it's a self-fulfilling prophecy that has caused that. We're going to fight that till our very last breath. We are very proud to propose.
Finance apprentice speaker, Yasmin Lukuma.
Wow, there are very few people in the world that can pronounce that. The biggest, strangest, most idiotic concession that came out from the speaker before me was to say, well, the information is going to be out there, it's going to be elusive, it's going to be out there, people just need to hunt for it. If activists can hunt for this information to gain their cause, they need to tell us why these news channels who can earn profit from these information aren't going to hunt for the very same information and create the very same headlines on that side. They never told us what exactly they were changing and how exactly they were solving it. What we're going to do in this speech is very clear. We gave you 3 end goals and outcomes on side opposition. First, that we wanted a fairer trial process and accountability. Secondly, that we wanted greater discourse on social issues by the entire community. And thirdly, that we wanted to align incentives of the state into priority investment of solving social lacks and problems in the community. We tell you that this means that there is more good to these details being out there than the harms side government wanted to give you. Before that, let's deal with what exactly was government's burden in this debate, because they never really fulfilled any of them. The first burden they had was that the media, to prove to us that the media propagates untrue stereotypes and unfair stereotypes in a particular fashion. This was built on a false premise. It was built on an assumption that all articles in these media outlets were going to be built on Indian rapist or Indian criminal commits a particular crime. But if not, all criminals are Indians, then your headlines will say different titles, right? At some point, you will have Chinese rapists or Malay rapists in your headline as well, which breaks the stereotype that rapists are all Indians, which means they couldn't prove to us that the media always propagates untrue stereotypes. But that case, even if it was, that a particular media outlet only identified Indian rapists and refused to report on your black rapists or your Malay rapists just because they were racist that way as a media outlet, that is a case built and works only in the context of one media outlet targeting one particular section of society. It was their burden then to prove to us that because there is one kind of media outlet that does that to one kind of section of society, that all personal details in all media outlets across the country needs to be banned. We don't think they did that. But secondly, the burden on their side was, let's assume that this was a problem, that really these details really caused that huge of a stereotypical issue. They needed to prove to us that removing these details from the media actually removed the racism in both the institutions and in society, considering that these segregations and stereotypes in status quo already exist. Not done. Why? Because just because Utusan Malaysia stopped saying Indian doesn't mean I stopped speculating that that rapist was Indian anyway. If I felt that it was something that was a problem, if I felt in status quo that all rapists are Indian or all Indians are rapists, the title rape happened is going to, in my mind, perpetuate that that was an Indian that did it anyway. So they never proved to us that taking these media titles out somehow changed the stereotype or changed the perception in society. But lastly, they needed to prove to us that personal details of all nature will always lead to more harm than good. Because this debate wasn't about racism alone. It was about social class. It was about education levels. It was about gender. It was a lot more than blatant, ignorant racism. And we think that on that side, they have failed to identify the larger issues in this debate when you strip a person and you strip an individual of all of their personal identities simply because there is a racism end goal on that side. We don't think it's justified. Let's look at why we think that on our side, our end goals were fulfilled a lot better. The first end goal we wanted to go for was the fairer trial process and accountability. For this, the only response they had was, well, it can happen anyway. We will somehow, somewhere, in some hypothetical scenario, have the ability to create a fairer trial process and accountability without any form of justification as to how it works. We told you that in order to ensure that we hold racist judges accountable, because they are almost in all scenarios upper-class white middle-aged men and are very rarely counted against, that you needed your social activism to be large. You needed to get popular support on your side that certain facts were of a certain problem and therefore you can counter it and go to a court. The only way you can have a debate or have an issue about diverse juries or about racist judges, about sentencing laws, about police racism, about higher rates of conviction of certain kinds of demographics is if your media stories have these details. Because an increased transparency means that you have an increased ability to hold your institutions accountable, which means your social activism groups have the ability to garner the popular support they need to even bring this issue up into higher realms of society and to your institutions in the first place. We don't think that they are able to do that by blanking out all of this information from society. The previous speaker before me said, well, it's elusive and these social activist groups will find a way to find this information anyway. The burden on that side of the house in this debate was to defend a sealing off of this information. If this information was out there anyway, then we don't see what exactly they're changing on that side. But lastly, on the next issue, right, we tell you that at the end of the day, this debate was a lot more than just the media. Sure, the media has its issues and its problems, and we're happy to say that in certain scenarios, we do restrict information all of the first 2 minutes of PM. Right? There are some scenarios where information is restricted because the media does perpetuate it wrongly. But the benefits that come out of it are far greater, and this is where we talk about discourse and aligning incentives before that goal.
Only the increased ability to maintain the predispositions that you just said were unchangeable because of those existing stereotypes. We want to crack down on that, not make fairer trials at the end of the day. Our burden was clear and simple. It's just mainstream media we're talking about, not the release of information.
If you're accepting that they are unchangeable in the minds of individuals who already believe it in a particular way, they need to tell us why the media titles changed anything. We don't think that that actually happens. But we tell you, and more importantly, you actually break that stereotype and you actually deal with the issues they wanted on that side when you allow for greater academic discussion about social trends in society. All of Hui's analysis that came out specifically in Hui that they didn't want to respond to because they assumed it sounded like Mitra's case. We think that the intersectionality of social trends means that there's an academic and political discourse about a combination of social trends. Not just that you're black and therefore you cause certain trouble, but because you're black and you're poor and you're a man that lives off a certain educational level, and the combination of social trends leads you to certain activities or certain actions in your life. That kind of academic discussion and social discourse is extremely important to what the state considers its incentives when it prioritizes its budget, when it prioritizes what it wants to do when solving social lacks on a daily basis. We think this information being out there in the open is extremely important for how a state defines its priorities and how a society defines its priorities. We heard absolutely no response on this front from side government. We're very proud to win.
Right, we're on the slide now, and by Lulu Yi. Yeah.
Prejudice is a menace best countered with informed discourse. With limited info, you get generalizations like, oh, he must be Indian because all Indians rape. But with proper social discourse based on proper revelation of particulars, you get people thinking and talking about how does the pressure of race and social class influence crime, be it its judgments, or the pressure of your social groups to commit certain crimes because you have no other choice, or police treatment. So the question really is which side best makes a transition from ignorant generalizations that we all fear to informed discourse, and thereby creates more equal courts and a more equal society. To prove that we have done that, I have three clashes today. Firstly, on their flawed premises. Secondly, on the idea of a judicial process and social discourse. And lastly, I will go a bit meta and weigh the two issues to show why ours matter the most. So firstly, on their premises, they told us two things. Firstly, they told us, oh, all Indians rape. So it would really suck if we reveal that Indians are rapists and people will generalize and say, oh, that must be the case. We tell you that fact will speak for itself. The minute you reveal that people of severe crimes come from diverse social backgrounds, that is a natural check against this sort of generalizations that were never true to begin with. Furthermore, even if it was the case that the majority of rapists are somehow Indian, and I don't believe in that, right? At least we show that you may be Indian, but other social factors also come into play. And therefore, it is not fair for you to uniformly assume that all rapists come from one group. Very simple logical flaw. Second issue they came up with. Their cases premise on the idea that all media is unfair and sensationalist, right? Firstly, I think we push them in the end to concede that they're talking more about subjectivity and not sensationalism. Already a concession of a case shift on your part. But at the same time, we think that having some sensationalist media is better than speculation, right? Like in the Boston Marathon bombings we talked about. But most problematically, at the end, it came out and told us that the idea of media in the modern age is little racist enclaves, each watching their own racist channels. In the age of internet and free media, I find that highly uncompelling. Especially given a widespread attention of the public, trying to find out from the most reliable source what is going on in the controversial case. And anyway, right, I don't think that they are being very fair because we realize there are many sources out there covering the crimes from different perspectives, especially information is made freely available, so as Viha said, it can be clearly found out if some channels are being biased or skewed. So besides media, right, what else is more important? And that brings me nicely on to what we have run for you so far. We realize that ignored the entire idea of a judicial process, but it's really weird in the case about criminal suspects in trials, right? So what we realize that what we have told you, that the judicial process is properly put under scrutiny. Judges are forced to take note of social differences and whether they are letting their own social prejudices influence the way the police and the courts work. At the same time, we also told you that how this changes social discourse, right? How this empowers intersectional discourse. And we realize that at some point they begin to concede that there is a big aim to want social equality in discourse, especially when they told us, well, the media, as in activists, can still go out there and try and find information on what is really going on, right? So there is a concession that it is right for you to try and know the truth. It's right for activists to try and find out what is going on. So firstly, given that we don't see why to put them through an obstacle course of information, right? At the same time, if according to the motion, you don't release information, I don't see how our activists are going to find the information that you think is so important. So that makes no sense whatsoever. Let's go on then in my last 40 seconds to a more meta level. So I've shown you that there are 3 issues, right? The emphasis on the media that we have disproved, and then judicial process, social discourse. But assuming that we lose the media point, and I don't think so. We still think that our points that we want take more weightage. Because what is the media truly for in this debate, right? They also think that the media must be checked to check, say, prejudice against Indians that rape and so on. So really the issue is to firstly check prejudice. Therefore, meeting our outcomes of discourse and solving a social lack in the judicial system. Well, so given that they consider activism is right, we think that we take that. At the same time, media is ready to ensure the fair treatment of judgments out there, right? To make sure the judiciary is fair, as we say. For all these reasons, therefore, we have firstly shown you, we want our courts to be fair. We want social pressure to know the truth and make that happen. We also want prejudice to be checked on a larger scale in society. We think that we best allow the media to do so. They've been very narrow in how they see the media. For all those reasons, I'm extremely proud to oppose.
Last say goes to government. And look, see. Hey.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's just try to envision the world we want to live in. Let's live in their world, then let's move over to ours. And at the end, I want you to decide which world you'd rather live in. As a reasonable person that cares about your fellow other human beings, what world would you rather live in? So let's look at their world first. This is a world that has this really weird misconception about media. They assume that the media is going to be so objective that they're going to reveal every social factor and leave it to you to decide what social factors really play a part in that crime. Ignoring the fact that websites such as the Daily Mail, Utusan Melayu, or even the Star newspaper, they love to craft narratives. They love to cherry pick certain characteristics of that person. Like, sure, this person can be Indian, he can be poor, but let's craft a narrative that says he's Indian and he's a rapist therefore. It's very subtle. We can't really stop it. But yet we give the power to the media to have the ability to cherry pick and create narratives that shape our entire society. Like, they say that objectively, there are always going to be Chinese rapists too. And when this appears in the media, people will balance it out. But I don't really hear much about Chinese rapists, even though that exists. I don't hear about Malay rapists. I don't hear about all the other races. For some reason, my understanding of rape is that it's associated with this one race. This one race that the media decided to pick on because that just gives them more money, isn't it? So that's the first assumption they made. They assume that the media is going to be objective. We think that's wrong. But second of all, they also assume that humans are objective, that they're going to naturally regulate the information that's given to them. But the problem is, when you read that news article, your natural response as a person has many other things to do in your life isn't to act upon it, isn't to be an activist. You just allow that news article to shape your perception in a very subtle way. It allows you to affiliate and draw links that maybe, yeah, this race is not to be trusted. You can't assume that humans are going to be entirely objective, and they can be bombarded with these narratives crafted by media and still be able to come out of it unscathed. So that's another assumption they made. But what other reasons did they use to justify segregation? Well, the first reason, and we're not going to let them get away with this, we're going to remind you that they said that people deserve to know if there's a statistical correlation between your social factors and the crime you commit. People deserve to prepare ahead and let their children know. Besides the fact that this is blatant racism and we don't think that your social factors necessarily cause a crime, we also think that news articles are not statistics. They just give you a story and you infer the statistics from it. So even if you want to talk about statistical correlation, it doesn't happen in your side. It's just a news story that makes an impression upon you. They also say they want discourse. Yeah, discourse is great. We love discourse. But tell us why this form will work. Please tell us how an instance where society has seen this racial or classist kind of news article and said that we are going to react constructively on this issue. We're actually going to do something. Prove us an instance and maybe it'll give you some credence. But it doesn't work that way. How does society react? How does a normal person react? They just look at the article and allow that to shape the perception of their world. Please tell us how discourse is going to exist when in every other instance for the past 2,000 years or whatever, people do not react the way you want them to react. They react in a different way. But they also say they want a fair trial. This doesn't really relate very well to criminal suspects. We think that it kind of appeared only towards the end of the case. In the end, it became all about fair trial. We don't understand this idea. We're just going to be honest with you. We don't get how telling us a news article identifying race and social class is going to make a judge more fair. Please tell us how. Like, naturally, if the judge gives you a stupid reasoning, it is not justified, that's going to highlight to you that maybe something is wrong. How is telling the mass populace that this person is an Indian or whatever, a Chinese, is going to somehow make the entire court process more fair? when it hasn't already done so in the past. Like these ideas, they sound really great coming from side opposition, but they're actually extremely idealistic and they don't really make sense. But what about our world? This is a very simple world. It's a world where we force the media to adopt an objective platform. We don't trust you to mention the social issues because we know what you're going to do. You're going to cherry pick, you're going to create narratives that are bad to society. This is also a world where we break that self-fulfilling prophecy. We stop marginalizing people. We allow that, I mean, it's not perfect, but it's something. At the very least, we are taking away the power to create perceptions and to craft narratives from the media. This is a world where we deny the media the right to control what we believe in. We decide what we want to believe in. And we think that humans inherently, they are reasonable people if you don't keep on bombarding them with this kind of power that the media has. This is a world we champion, and this is a world we fight for. We're very proud to focus.
That's the debate. Thank you very much. Teams to scrum the floor, take hands, and wait up.
That's wrong.
You go see if they're Indian or not. Tell you that they are. You're eating air.
Shut up. It's more than air. A little bit more than air.
Chips there. Nah, good.
What's the scoring range again?
69 to 81.
Reply is out of 50, right?
Huh?
Reply speeches out of 50.
Basically, yeah, that range,
You have like half.
yeah. Kat sana running kan? Tadi first speech was affected lah because aku dah letak masuk dalam USB tapi dia tak dapat detect.